Widowhood, caregiving, and the messiness of grief are just some of the topics we're discussing with our guest, grief coach John Polo. You're connected with the Heart of Hospice. I'm Helen Bauer, here with Jerry Finter.
Whether you're a family caregiver or an end-of-life professional, we're here to enhance your hospice experience by connecting you with information you can use about end-of-life care.
Today's episode is sponsored by our friends at GrandPad. Do you have an older family member who's isolated, or do you feel disconnected from a senior loved one who lives at a distance? The team at GrandPad has come up with the perfect solution, an easy-to-use device that connects older adults with family and friends using video chat, email, photo sharing, and more. Visit grandpad.net for details. Today's guest, John Polo, grief coach, author, speaker, caregiver,
right,
widow. He's awesome. He's got an incredible story.
He does have an incredible story. So here's what we need to let you know about right from the very beginning. John is a young widow.
Yes, he lost his wife in January of 2016 to a cancer diagnosis.
Right, and they had only been together for, I think he said, 5 years?
Total. They had been apart. They had dated as very young people, had split, and then gotten back together. So they had not been married for very long.
Right. And so today he's going to tell you more about his story and her story, their story, and also about the kind of emotions that he went through. And he talks about how his grief really got kind of messy at one point. And then also he's going to talk about how he began to see his grief change. He began to experience gratitude, actually.
Yes.
And he changed from grief to gratitude. Actually, well, we'll talk about that more in the interview.
We always try to tell our guest stories, but nobody can tell John's story better than himself. So here's our conversation with grief coach John Polo.
John, we are very glad to have you on the Heart of Hospice podcast.
Yeah, thank you guys so much for having me on today.
John, you do a lot of speaking in different places. Where's one of the favorite places that you like to go?
Well, my favorite place is San Diego, and that's where I'm actually planning on moving within the next year or two. So that's by far my favorite place, no doubt.
San Diego. Do you like it for the weather?
The weather, the culture, the water, the restaurants, everything. Like, I'm already there on a soul level, and in my heart, it's just my physical body that is still in Illinois.
I got you.
So we're going to jump right into it. We want to hear about your journey with your wife, Michelle, and how you came to work as a grief coach.
Yeah, so I'll tell you a little bit about the journey with Michelle. So we actually grew up in the same town, but we never really knew each other. And then we both moved away in different directions. And we would both go back to that small town right outside of Chicago to hang out with friends. The circle of friends that we each had individually kind of merged. And through that, we became friends. And in time, I developed a huge crush on her. And I finally one day got up the courage to ask her out through AOL Instant Messenger. So we dated in high school for a year. We broke up. It was a pretty bad breakup. So between the fact that it was a pretty bad breakup and we lived pretty far away from each other, about an hour and a half, we lost all contact for 7 years. 7 years later, I was sitting at my table. I still remember the moment, checking email, and an email popped up from her. And I couldn't breathe. I couldn't swallow. I couldn't do anything. I had a panic attack and I had to go get some water first. And I took a sip of water and I went back and I read the email. And she was giving me condolences on my dad, who had passed away a couple of years earlier. She would later admit to me that she had been stalking my Facebook, which is how she found that out. They really bonded when we dated in high school. They both like to kind of pick at me and make fun out of me. So we talked for an entire year, a whole year, before we actually saw each other in person. I think we were both so scared because of how hurt we both were when we broke up in high school. But we finally did see each other in person. We decided, we have always loved each other. So we started to build a life together. About a year and a half after that, I proposed. And then a year after that, she got diagnosed with one of the worst and aggressive cancers you can get. She had that for 2.5 years. We did a ton of surgeries, chemo, radiation, all of that type of stuff. And she passed away in January of 2016. So it's been just over 6 years. As far as the grief coaching, obviously, I was consumed by grief really while she was sick and after she died as well, obviously. And I also didn't know what to do with myself because my purpose as a husband, as a caretaker, as all those things, it wasn't there anymore. And a friend suggested I start a blog. And I didn't even read blogs, let alone know how to start one. But I remember I Googled how to start a blog. And I started one the very next day. And I made a matching Facebook page. And early on, obviously, I had no intention of doing anything I do now as far as coaching or writing books. It was just a place for me to kind of process my grief. But I don't think the world was especially used to a 31-year-old man talking that openly about his grief, kind of sharing his heart with the world. So it took off in popularity. 18 months after that, I actually put out my first book and I got my first speaking gig. And then shortly after that, I saw a need for grief coaching. People would come to me and they would, want to talk to me about their grief. They would want help. And I saw the need for that. And I also saw that I had the ability to do that. So that's why I decided to start doing it.
So your grief started early on, before Michelle's death, right? Before the actual loss. In hospice, we call that anticipatory grief. You're anticipating what's happening. And there is so much loss of your roles and your sense of identity as a spouse, that sort of thing. So as Michelle's caregiver in this time where she was so sick during your marriage, what were the most meaningful parts for you as her caregiver?
Yeah, I just have to say about that anticipatory grief, I had it so bad for the entire 2.5 years. To be reunited, to only have 2 years together before she got sick, and then to pretty much know she was going to die because we knew from the get-go how bad this cancer was. I had such bad anticipatory grief. And unfortunately, nobody used that terminology with me. I actually read something about anticipatory grief months after she died. And I was like, that's me. That's what I had. And I mean, logically, it makes sense. But hearing that there was actually, a word for it, verbiage for it, made me feel better because I realized what was happening in retrospect. To your question about the most meaningful part of caring for Michelle. So my wife had a really, really, really difficult life, even before the cancer. And when we dated in high school, I had really bad self-esteem issues at that point, and she had really bad self-worth issues at that point. I would always tell her, you're going to leave me for someone better. You're going to date the quarterback of the football team, my young, insecure 17-year-old self. And she would always cry to me that everyone leaves me, John, everyone hurts me, and you will too. She had some deep abandonment issues. So for me, the most meaningful part was the fact that I got to show her how worthy of love she was. In those last 5 years we were together, even the last 2.5 years that she was sick, I got to show her for the first time in her life that she was worthy of true, unconditional, real love, and I never left her side. And that to me is something that, even despite the hell that we went through, I have so much gratitude that I was able to show her that before she died.
Oh, that's wonderful.
That is so meaningful. That is really a very meaningful part of the relationship that you had with her. You mentioned the anticipatory grief, and if I can, I'd like to go back to that for just a moment. You said that you figured out through just your own research about the anticipatory grief. What would you recommend for people who are in that kind of situation now? So they have a partner who's terminally ill. They are experiencing this anticipatory grief. What can that person do who's the caregiver provider? What can they do to manage that that anticipatory grief?
Yeah, there's a couple things that pop into my head. First off, seek some kind of support, right? Whether it's a therapist, a social worker, a grief coach, a grief counselor. I would say seek out someone to talk to, a best friend. You don't have to go at this alone. I would say second is, and this is really hard, but as I look back at those 2.5 years, and I don't have many regrets, and I have forgiven myself, but even though I have forgiven myself, the one regret I do have is that I was so consumed by the fact that my wife was going to die that I didn't get to really enjoy the fact that she was still there for 2.5 years. Now, look, she was very, very, very sick for a good amount of that time. So it's hard to enjoy it, right? But even during the times when she wasn't that sick, or even during when she was in remission and she was feeling pretty good, I was so consumed by the fact that it was going to come back, because that's what the doctor said, no doubt about it, it was going to come back, that I didn't get to enjoy her those last 2.5 years. And even though I have forgiven myself for that, if I could go back in time, that's what I would do differently. I would say try to enjoy the time that you still have with them, even though I understand how difficult that can be when you're facing what you're facing.
Yeah, I would think that would be such a hard balance to live in the moment, but still carrying that knowledge. I mean, we all do that to some extent anyway, right? Because we know that our partners, our loved ones have finite endpoints. Everybody's going to die at some point. But to know that there's such a limit on a young person's life, and then yet you still want to live in the moment, be present with her there and then. What a difficult balance. I would think that would be very challenging.
It was. It was. And that's why I say it's incredibly difficult. Sometimes I will have clients who lost their spouse, their loved one to cancer, and they'll tell me that one of their regrets was that they didn't really talk about a whole ton. Like they kind of lived in denial. And while I fully understand that that's their regret, and we want to validate that because that's a real thing, I also do tell them, I wish I did a little bit more of that, right? I wish I did a little bit more living with her instead of completely being consumed by the fact that she was going to die. But that is not an easy feat.
Yeah, I can imagine. How do you ever actually, this is probably not the best way to put it, but how do you forget that this is happening, right? How do you actually put that out of your mind? I wouldn't think that's even possible.
Yeah, thankfully, we did have some good times the last 2.5 years, but that truth of what is coming, it becomes a part of you that just doesn't leave. And again, not everyone has that happen to them. Again, I have clients and friends who the opposite is true. They were. I really do have client calls where they will tell me we lived in the moment. We enjoyed, the time we had together. And I personally think that that's fantastic. That's what I wish I would have done. But as with everything in life, I realize I'm human and I don't beat myself up about it.
So do you think maybe there's a purpose to anticipatory grief, that there are good things that can come as a result of it? Because at least I would think so, that there are conversations that you can have. It's the ugly ass elephant in the room that you need to talk about, and probably your loved one wants to talk about it. And I would think it would be very validating because, let's face it, there's not a Hallmark card that says, I'm sorry your spouse is getting ready to die.
Right.
I think it would be very validating for someone to say, my God, you must be so angry. Or you must feel so, do you have guilt that you put off treatment with her? Things like that. People have a lot of regrets about how treatment is handled. And so many different emotions, depression, guilt, rage, denial, all of that gets wrapped up into anticipatory grief. So really, anticipatory grief is just as complicated as grief after the actual loss.
Yeah. I was so incredibly angry the whole time she was sick. I was just so angry, like, whatever we want to say. I mean, to the universe, whoever I was angry at, why even bring her back in my life just to have this happen? Plus all the other reasons I was angry. I was, I often say I was the most angry, bitter man in the world at that point. But Michelle and I did get to say goodbye. We did get to talk about the things that, people who lose their loved ones suddenly don't get to talk about. Now, I don't think it's better or worse. I think both are equally horrible. But I also do have gratitude for the fact that we were able to say things to each other that, not everyone gets the opportunity to say.
Do you find that you look back now and you can see the beauty in the whole experience with Michelle?
As I said, I was the most bitter person ever. And there's a lot that goes into our story that I don't even talk about in public still. There was a moment that began to change my life. I didn't realize it was going to be a significant moment when it happened, but it has proven to be. And it was maybe about 2 weeks before Michelle passed. She was in hospice. She was in a coma-like state. And I was in the other room. They had like a little side room right next door to her room. And I was in that little side room talking to my sister. And I was just, sobbing uncontrollably. I was so angry. I was a mess of epic proportions, as you would expect. And my sister said to me, I'm going to try to remember here, word for word. She said, would you rather have not got back together with her and years later found out that she died of this horrible disease? And again, my story is unique, as everybody's story is unique. But one of the things that started my evolution towards gratitude, towards inner peace, towards all of those things was that thought. It was, again, we became very close to not getting those last 5 years together. And even though what happened to her was absolutely horrible, I feel incredibly blessed to have had those last 5 years with her.
So, John, how did you move from that place where you were angry, you had those emotions, to a place of gratitude? I say obviously. Did it take time for that to happen? Was it one of these overnight experiences, or was it something that you had to work on over time?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I really was incredibly angry for the entire 2.5 years. It was actually when she was in hospice and when she fell into that like coma-like state where she would only get up a couple minutes a day, I began to write her eulogy. And then I began to write the first 27,000 words of our full love story, which is a book I'll publish in a couple of years probably. And through those two writings, her eulogy and the beginning of our love story, because it was really only where like the high school part of it that I got to, I began to work through that anger in those moments. Between those things and what my sister said to me, I started looking at her not just as my wife was dying, not just as, how could the universe do this to us, but I started to remember all the amazing times we had together, the amazing love we shared, what an amazing human she was. And through that process, I started to work through the anger. I will say, though, gratitude doesn't walk alone, right? So just because I have gratitude doesn't mean I don't feel cheated. Like, we got ridiculously cheated, and both of those things are my truth.
Right. Yeah, and the gratitude doesn't also mean that you don't have grief.
Right.
Yeah, you can
100%.
Yeah, you can still have gratitude and grief, and they can be there alongside each other simultaneously.
Well, right. And that's the thing, like, grief is so complicated. You can have gratitude, while you're angry, you can have grief, as you're rebuilding and finding happiness. I think a lot of people just have this one vision of what grief looks like. I won't get into the whole story, but last year, if I look at my 2021, last year, my biggest grief moment over the loss of my wife came during one of my happiest moments last year. Because I remember sitting there, I guess I will get into a little bit of the story. I remember sitting there, I was out with friends. We were at a karaoke bar. And I was feeling really good about myself, like I have done a lot of work on myself. I was having a great time. I was with new friends. And I was overcome with grief. I didn't cry in that moment, but I was overcome with grief at everything I had been through. For me personally, feeling like, she was watching, knowing she was proud of me. That was a grief moment, even though it was a happy moment. So grief is an incredibly complicated, complex thing.
I think that's really important to remember. I don't know that we've ever talked about that on the podcast. And we've talked about grief a lot, but to have that duality, that partnership of grief, the sadness, the weight of grief, along with being happy.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I would think that there might be some guilt that comes with that. I shouldn't be happy. I'm not supposed to be happy. Grief doesn't look like this. But in reality, that's who we are as humans. Our emotions span all of that.
Yeah. I thankfully don't have any guilt anymore, although that's something I obviously worked with. I know that a lot of my clients still struggle with that, and we work on it. That is something that, as you move forward, it doesn't matter how far out you are. Like Michelle and I, we were legally married, but we didn't get married like at a wedding, like a beautiful wedding ceremony. We got married at a courthouse when she was sick. And she died 2 weeks before our actual wedding ceremony was to take place. Like when her cancer came back, we planned an actual wedding ceremony, like a beautiful one. And she died right before that. So if I fall in love again, and I actually have a real wedding ceremony with a bride walking down the aisle, it's going to be an incredibly happy day. It's going to be incredibly bittersweet. And there's going to be a lot of sadness there as well. Now, I'm not going to feel guilty, thankfully, even though there would be nothing wrong with that. And I have dealt with guilt in the past. But that goes back to just incredibly how complex grief and healing are.
The team at GrandPad has created a great device to help families stay connected despite distance and lockdowns. The GrandPad utilizes a simple format that allows seniors to easily access technology. Internet access, video chat, and email, along with games and music, are just a few of the features that GrandPad offers. GrandPad comes with 4G LTE cellular service already included, so there's no need for Wi-Fi. Users can create a private family network that allows for secure photo and video sharing. At the core of the GrandPad team are the Grand Advisors, a group of seniors that continually inspire, test, and guide the development of GrandPad. The company has built a platform that empowers seniors of all ages and technological skills to connect with family, friends, and caregivers. The GrandPad team strives to create a world where no seniors are lonely or isolated. Using innovation and current communication tools, they keep older adults connected to their younger family members. To purchase a GrandPad subscription for your loved one, visit grandpad.net. Or to purchase multiple devices for your business or facility, visit grandpad.biz. Now, back to today's discussion.
John, can we go back and talk about your hospice experience with Michelle?
Sure.
So Jerry and I on the Heart of Hospice podcast, we always try to highlight the great things about hospice because end-of-life care is awesome if it's done well. But of course, we don't always get it right. You know, hospice professionals are human too, and we make mistakes. What would you say were the best things about the hospice care that Michelle received?
I would say the best thing, my dad, when he died in 2008, he had at-home hospice. Michelle was in care. She was in the facility. Mm-hmm. One of the best things for me personally was I finally didn't have to take care of her alone. Like I could just press a button and have someone in the room within, 60 seconds, giving her or I what we needed. And the other thing was, and we were there for 22 days and a lot of stuff happened at that hospice during our stay, but we really did become what felt like family with them. And I'm not going to say every single person there, but 99% of the people there, like, really cared about us. I can just tell when someone's doing their job, and that's perfectly fine if someone's just doing their job. But when somebody really cares about you or your dying person, it's something you just don't forget. Like, they still have a place in my heart because of the care, and not just like, the medicine or the water, whatever they were giving us, but the actual care in their heart that they gave to us.
That's really good. I love the way that you described that.
It's good for hospice professionals to hear, too.
It is. Because I think you're right. 99% of the people who work in hospice are very genuinely caring people with compassionate hearts.
Yeah. Even on our busiest days, I think that's true. So, okay, then I'm going to ask you, what, if anything, did they get wrong?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I don't remember how long it was. I think it was maybe about a week span, although it could have only been a couple days, but it felt like years. Michelle was waking up and she was having terminal agitation. And it was really, really, really horrific. I'm not even going to get into the specifics, but the hallucinations, what was happening was horrific. And finally, after some amount of time, and again, it might have only been 3 days. I don't know. It felt like years. But finally, after some amount of time, they said, okay, we have a drug that we can give her and, it will make her comfortable. And I'm like, she won't wake up, because they were giving her enough medicine to knock out like an 800-pound man. I mean, the amount of medicine they were giving her, and she was waking up. She was 5 foot, 70 pounds at this point. So I was like, this medicine you're saying, it will make it so she doesn't wake up. And so she's not having these horrible hallucinations and this terminal agitation. And they're like, yes, we only have to give it a couple times a year. I'm like, give it to her. And just looking back, I don't know why they waited so long. Yeah. That's the only thing that I am not thrilled about with the experience at hospice.
Terminal agitation is a really hard symptom to manage sometimes. And I think maybe hospice nurses and physicians are a little reluctant to use some of those heavy-hitting drugs.
Right.
So that may have been what it was. But yeah, it's good for other people who might be experiencing hospice care right now to hear those kind of things. Sounds like you were a big advocate for Michelle. Yeah,
I mean, I've always been one of those people who can advocate for other people, and used to not be able to advocate for myself, although that's changed. But I saw it in 2008 when my dad had cancer. You have to be an advocate. It's not about doctors and nurses not caring, but especially as the caretaker, like, you see everything. You know exactly, what's helping them, what's not helping them. You have to speak up. And I did. I mean, I was on top of it, no doubt.
Yeah. The caregiver's the expert.
Right.
Right? Mm-hmm. The other people are the medical experts. You're the patient expert. You're the person expert. Yeah. Caregivers have to be advocates like that, and thank goodness for them.
So we've talked a lot about your experience while Michelle was still alive. Let's talk about your experience afterwards. Okay. So you write about talking with other people at a support group for widows, and that finding a widow, quote unquote, can be characterized by a lot of different types of relationships, maybe even unmarried partners or boyfriend, girlfriends, or people who were engaged to be married but hadn't been married and when the person died. So tell us your thoughts about this, what we call disenfranchised grief. In other words,
that's a great question.
Yeah, grief that happens when, these people are not supposed to be grieving. At least that's what the world says, but they are.
Right. That's a great question. I mean, I'll say first, before I answer the question directly, I don't know how you guys feel about that, but I just feel like our society really doesn't understand grief.
Right.
It's been a little bit shocking to me just how much our society just does not understand grief. It really has been. To your question exactly, though. So I was at a little dinner for, widowed people in Chicago. We have a little, Chicagoland group that would meet for dinner every once in a while. And there was a woman there who I didn't know. And we got to talking. And after she said something, I wasn't sure if she was a widow or not because of the way that she said what she said. And it turns out that she lost her fiance. And she was hesitant to use that word because people made her feel like, her grief wasn't valid. And at first I said, well, you're a widow. And then I kind of reined myself in and realized that she may not want to use that word. So I was like, well, you can call yourself whatever you want, right? But your grief is real. And to me, you're a widow. And I just think that you cannot measure love by a piece of paper. I don't care if you have a ring on your finger. I don't care if you have a marriage license. As far as widowed people, if you are in love with somebody and either plan to or want to spend the rest of your life with that person and they pass, your grief is every bit as valid as the person who had 50 years, the person who, I only had 5 years, but was married. The piece of paper or the ring thing is completely irrelevant to me. But unfortunately, many people in society who only lost their boyfriend or girlfriend or only lost their fiance, and I say only with some sarcasm there, they get told that they can't grieve the way the rest of us grieve. And I think that's just really unfair.
Yeah, you're just a boyfriend, just a girlfriend.
Right.
Yeah, just a common law spouse, just a partner. Yeah, it's a lesser grief for some reason.
Right. And that even goes to how long you had. So sometimes people might look at me and be like, well, come on, you were only together for 5 years. We lost our 50 years. Right? We lost our 50 years. And sometimes people might look at somebody who had 50 years and be like, well, come on now, you had 50 years. They don't even remember life
right.
before their love. So they're all different, but they're all horrible, if we're being honest, in their own unique way.
Yeah, they're all valid. You can't say, oh, well, you were given 50 years, so it's a natural loss and it shouldn't hurt as much.
Right.
Yeah, it doesn't make any sense. But yeah, society decides there's a pecking order of who gets, if you're grieving a child, oh, that's right up there. That's, child loss is the big one. But grieving a spouse, grieving a sibling, and then you get into grieving a stepchild, grieving an ex-spouse. We sort of cubbyhole, like you're mostly dissatisfied, partially dissatisfied, or you're neutral, you gauge it and on a scale. And I think that's just a society thing. It's not really real. And it's definitely invalidating. Definitely.
Well, and the other two things I'll say really quickly are, first off, you can have somebody right now who's in love with their boyfriend and they lose their boyfriend after only a year, who, if we're being completely honest, might love that boyfriend more than somebody who's been with their spouse 30 years, but is in a loveless marriage. I mean, that's one thing. And the other thing is, a lot of time people think that, well, you had to have a good marriage in order to, grieve. That's not true either. People who had, bad marriages, or people who, were abused, whatever. I mean, their grief sometimes is even more complicated. I have a straight line with my grief. I loved Michelle with all my heart. We tried to beat the cancer. She passed away. There's not a ton of complication there. But sometimes people who had rocky relationships, they have the grief and they have the complicated feelings of the rocky relationship still with them.
Yeah, it goes back to that balance. You can feel grief at the same time you feel resentment because this was a former spouse, right, that was abusive. I think that's completely normal. Life is just messy. Grief is messy.
Yep. It is.
Yeah.
I think society tends to invalidate people's grief to make themselves feel better or to make them feel comfortable, because grief is very uncomfortable. When you're with someone who is grieving, it's uncomfortable. And so as a way to make themselves feel better, they kind of invalidate the other person's grief. Well, you shouldn't be grieving this person. You weren't even married to them. You were just boyfriend, girlfriend. Or as in your case, you were married to her for this length of time, so you shouldn't be grieving as much as somebody who was married 50 years. But then they tell the person who was married 50 years, well, you shouldn't be grieving because you had 50 years. It makes no sense. And yet society does that to make themselves feel comfortable in the presence of people who are grieving. Why can't we just accept that people grieve and it's okay? Just be present with the person who's grieving. That's what they need, is to accept that.
But if I invalidate your grief, someone who has this grief that's disenfranchised, not particularly, it doesn't rank as high on the scale, then I don't have to sit in discomfort. I don't have to look at your complicated grief or try to figure out how to be present with you in that. I don't have to figure out how to partner with you to support you. Invalidate it, and then I don't have to be involved in it. So it's about our own comfort, I think. Right? If I invalidate your grief, then I don't have to do anything for you.
Right.
I would agree.
Yeah,
Yep.
that's probably pretty simplified, but I think that is it. It doesn't come down to what do I need to do to make you feel comfortable. It's coming down to what do I need to do to make myself feel comfortable with your grief.
So, John, you talked about how you had clients that you have talked to. So you're a grief coach. Tell us more about what you do. Tell us about the kind of services that you offer.
Yeah. So a little bit after my first book came out, again, I saw the need. So I started the grief coaching, and it really evolved. At this point, I do kind of all around life coaching, although I don't really like to call it that. But if you go to my website, you'll see it says grief, dating, relationship, self-esteem, self-worth, purpose, motivation. And the reason why I expanded upon it is because people would come to me for their grief, but eventually they would want to start rebuilding. And what do we do when we start rebuilding? Well, we have to look at, our self-esteem and our self-worth and our purpose and our motivation and all these things. So I work with all types of clients. I have, 72-year-old clients. I have 24-year-old clients, widowed clients, people who lost parents or children. And I have, people who don't come to me for any type of loss at all. I have somebody, who might call me because they see the word self-esteem and they need help with that. I do one-on-one coaching as well as group coaching and workshops, and obviously the public speaking as well.
Tell us about your books, John.
Yeah, so the first book is called Widowed, Rants, Raves, and Randoms. The second book is called Widowed 2, Now I Live. And this doesn't feel like the right word, but I don't know what word to use. So it's kind of the sequel to the first one. And then the third book is actually for widowed people who want to start dating again. And it's called How to Date a Widow 101. And it's actually intended for the widowed person to read first and then to pass to a love interest if they so choose. I know for me, I've always had ADD. And then you add grief brain on top of it. I lost my attention span completely, really, when Michelle got sick. So I designed the books for people like that, because I think grief brain is such a big thing. It is incredibly easy to read. It's something where, you flip to a page and there might be a couple sentences, or if it's an entire page, it's a very easy to read one. And I also designed it. I had a vision in mind when I designed the book. So as I was writing it, I had a vision of somebody reading it on an airplane, and one page, they're crying and nodding their head. And then the next page, they're kind of laughing hysterically. I wanted to add some humor to it. Now, it's not kind of any kind of dark humor or humor about death. It's just, I'm a little bit of a weird person, so I put a little bit of my weird humor in there. I wanted to make it a very unique book, something that even if you've read 100 other grief books, you haven't quite read anything like this.
So what is the website that you have?
Yep, it's johnpolocoaching.com. So JOHN, and then Polo, like Marco Polo, coaching.com.
Okay. And you also have a podcast, or do you have multiple podcasts?
So I have multiple right now. I think I'm going to be stopping one because I didn't realize how much work it was. And I need to work on some other things. I want to finish my fourth book, which will be about our full love story. So I have one podcast that's about dating, relationships, and self-growth, and I'm probably going to be putting pause on that, although if it interests people, they can go back and listen to the first 30 episodes. And then I have another podcast that I do on grief and healing. And both of those podcasts you can find on my website with all the information and links as well.
All right, very good. And so the podcast that you have regarding grief is called My Person Died Too?
Yes, I do that with my friend Carolyn, who is also a widowed person. She came up with the title, which I think is a very good title. Yep, it's called My Person Died Too.
Interesting. We would invite our listeners to check out your podcast.
Thank you.
Okay, so one of the things that we like to do with all of our guests is to get your personal tips on self-care, because we know how important self-care is.
Or to just put you on the spot.
Yeah, we like to do that too.
It's a loaded question, let's face it.
Yeah. So tell us, what is your go-to healthy self-care routine or habit that you have?
So I'm going to give you two answers. The first answer I have is the simple one. The second one, I'm going to give you a little bit of a detailed answer. So the first one is, I don't have a coffee pot in my house, and I do that on purpose. For me, I know I'm going to be in the apartment all day doing coaching calls. So I will get up in the morning. I will go get my coffee from outside. The reason I do that is because I need the fresh air. Like, it's good for my heart, my soul, my mood, everything. And then I'll come back, and for the first hour of the day, I will put my phone in the other room and I'll just sit there with my coffee, whether it's in silence or it's listening to music. I also just want to tell a quick story about how I started to actually dive into self-care. Is that okay if I do that?
Absolutely.
Sure.
So it was about 8 months out, and I remember I was, had one of those on the floor sobbing type moments. And I thought about how I had been a caretaker my whole life. So I had been a caretaker for my mom from the time I was 12 to 27. I had been a caretaker for my dad for the year he had cancer before he passed. And then I had been a caretaker, obviously, for Michelle. And I realized in that moment, like, a light bulb came on. And I realized I had to begin to take care of myself the way I had taken care of everyone else my entire life. And in that moment, it wasn't like, oh, John, come on, you're worthy. You need to do this because you're worthy of it. It wasn't that at all. I realized it was essential. It was essential to not only me surviving, but once I wanted to start rebuilding, I had to do that. So one of the things I do for my self-care is I treat myself now the way I would treat someone I love. I treat myself the same way that I treated Michelle when she was here. I zoned in on my wife's every need when she was sick. I now zone in on John's every need, because after everything I've been through, I have to do that in order to continue to stay afloat and move forward towards the life that I want to live.
Wow.
Man, that's a whole podcast right there.
Yeah, that's for sure.
Awesome.
That's deep, though. I love that. I absolutely love that.
That is incredible.
So thank you for sharing that. And I think there's such depth in that, because it's difficult for most people to say, I need to meet my own needs.
Yeah.
Right.
We think it's selfish, and it's not. Self-care is not selfish.
No.
I like to say we're better at everything. We're better parents, partners, coaches, citizens. We're better to our fellow humans. Everyone benefits when we take care of ourselves. When we're at a bad place, mentally, emotionally, physically, spiritually, we're not even as good to other humans. Like, I know for me, I'm a pretty moody person. Catch me in a moment where I haven't been taking care of myself, I'm not going to be the best friend. But if I have been taking care of myself, everyone around me benefits, obviously, including myself.
Yeah, that's the perfect message to remember.
Yeah, and such good insight. Such good insight.
Well, and John, also the compassion fatigue that you must experience with your clients, just like hospice professionals, end-of-life professionals experience. Yeah, when you're working with a grief client, you're going to experience that emotional, spiritual wear and tear. It's the same thing.
Yeah, I like to say that even what you said is 100% accurate. And I like to say, after everything I've been through, there's a built-in level of exhaustion. And I have to take care of myself in order to combat that built-in level of exhaustion. I have to take care of myself. Otherwise, I'm going to start to sink into that exhaustion.
That's right. John, thank you for sharing your life with us today, your insights, your wisdom, and we really do hope that our listeners will take advantage of the things that you provide on your website, and we hope that what you have shared with us today will encourage them to know more about you. So our listeners, go to John's website at johnpolocoaching.com, and you'll find several great resources there that John offers. And if you'd like to know more about his coaching and maybe become one of his clients, you can also reach him through his website there at johnpolocoaching.com. John, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you guys so much for having me. It was great.
So I love that John is so transparent about I don't want to say just the anger, but these other emotions that people don't like to admit, that grief is tacky and it's angry and it's ugly and it's mad and it's regretful and guilty and resentful, all of those things, right? It's not all just, oh, I'm so sad they were a beautiful person. I'm just mad as hell and this is hard and I don't even want to do this. Right? Or why this has happened? Why has this happened to me, to her, to him? There's so much to it, so many different facets. And I love that he's like, let's embrace all of this and get it out there and admit that this is who we are as humans when we grieve.
Right, exactly. And he went through all of that, the anger at the fact that he didn't get 50 years with Michelle.
Right. And that she wasn't going to get all of the life events and the milestones and the years. Yeah, I love it that he was so transparent about that. A lot of insight there. And I love that acknowledgement and honesty.
Yes, his insights were pretty incredible, I think. The way that he looked at his grief with such self-awareness and the depth of just the thoughts that he had concerning grief and how it moves, and it pretty incredible guy to share all of this with us.
Well, and he says he didn't get to it overnight, right? So it takes a lot of work. And so I think that's where he realized the value of having someone to talk to. He said, talk to a professional. That's the first thing. Talk to a grief counselor, a grief coach, a licensed professional counselor, a social worker. So important to have someone to talk to. And John provides those services himself. I can imagine that he's able to relate to so many of the things that his clients deal with.
Right. Well, because of his own personal experiences with grief, today he helps others through their grief, through his social media accounts, his books that he's written. We'll talk about that here in just a minute. And of course, he does coaching as well. He says it's life coaching, but it's more than just life coaching.
Yes,
he says he really doesn't like to use the word life coach, but he says it's really more than just that. It's more than just life coach.
It's grief, it's relationships, all sorts of different things.
That's right. So John is the author of 3 books. And he's got a 4th book that he's actually working on now. He's also the host of 2 podcasts. This guy is busy.
He is busy.
He is very busy. And he works with clients, thousands of clients who all have different needs, and he's there to help them through with those things. And so he's very effective, very personable, and he has a unique style that I think most people will find to be very engaging.
So if you're looking for his books, you can go to johnpolocoaching.com. That's John, John. And he has Widowed, Rants, Raves, and Randoms. I like that. And then what he sort of refers to as the sequel, Widowed 2, called Now I Live. He has How to Date a Widow 101. I like that. Widowed and Widowed 2, you can get those together if you want to. You can find links to his podcasts and also opportunities to support his podcast financially. And you can purchase a coaching gift certificate for someone if you're interested.
Well, that's very interesting. I had not realized that he did that. What a great idea.
Yeah, so johnpolocoaching.com, and his podcasts are Gonna Love Me Too, and the 2 is the number 2, or My Person Died Too. That's the podcast that he co-hosts with Helen Bauer.
Thanks for listening to The Heart of Hospice. I'm Jerry Fenter here with Helen Bauer. Because we know your hospice journey is 24/7, you can always find us at theheartofhospice.com. Subscribe to the podcast wherever you're listening, and please leave a rating or a review on Apple Podcasts.
To connect with us, just send an email to host@theheartofhospice.com. You can also find us on social media. And remember, no matter who you are or where you are in your hospice journey, you are the heart of hospice.